Hi, in this Unity tutorial, I'm going to go over how to do parallax scrolling in a Unity 2D game. Basically, the end result of what we're going to have at the end of this tutorial is something like what we see right here. This is a character, just for demonstration purposes, that I'm controlling, and it looks like he's flying, and the backgrounds are moving at different speeds. So over here you can see we have three different backgrounds that are scrolling across. There's the clouds in the furthest away. They are scrolling the slowest. And then the mountains, which are the second furthest away, and they are scrolling at the middle speed. And then the closer we get to ourselves, the trees, they're scrolling the fastest. And that gives this effect of parallax scrolling. All right, so let's see, how do we do this? I'm going to stop this game and I'm going to make a new scene so we could start from scratch together. All right, so here's a new scene, and I have some assets down here. So the first thing we need are backgrounds to scroll. So when we do backgrounds and they're going to be in the scrolling, the backgrounds are going to have transparency. That means they are something that you could see through to what's behind them. They can't be solid, full square backgrounds. So an example of the transparency here, these clouds, let's just look at the source images that I kind of just made some source images here. These are clouds here. And if I were just drag and drop this on my desktop, and you see here the clouds, it's a solid image it shows it in the thumbnail, that's a solid image, that there's no background that you can see through it. But if I drag the mountains and put them up here, you'll see that you could see the mountains, but right behind the mountains, I could see my desktop wallpaper. This is a transparent image, and so are the trees. The trees are a transparent image, and this is just a way you could check to see if you do have transparent images. Okay, so now with those three transparent images, oh, the other thing I have is the dog that's flying, Underdog, a superhero from a long time ago. And Underdog here, he is transparent background too. So let's see, let me put them back here again. Trees, mountains, and clouds. And so those assets, I had dragged and dropped the clouds, the mountains, the trees, and the Underdog into Unity. And when you drag and drop them into Unity, they come in, and by default, they are going to be a texture type sprite when you have a 2D project. And something I want you to notice before I start explaining the scrolling, when you have sprites in 2D, they are going to be assigned to like a layer, like which one gets drawn in front of which one. It's kind of like if you had papers on a desk, which paper is on top of which paper. So here, say I put one and then I put another sprite. What happens when these two sprites overlap? How is it going to determine which sprite goes in front and which sprite goes in back, right? So what that's controlled with is something called order in layer. So if I were to pick the cloud sprite, the order in layer is 0. Sorry, I have a cold. The higher the order in layer, the more in front you can be sure that it will be drawn. Right now, I think it's just determining that the mountains go on top. Is it because of this? Because mountains is first? No, I don't know. And I'm not in control of it. It's basically got to pick to draw one on top of the other, even if their layer is both 0 and the mountains is layer 0. So if I want to make the mountains go behind it, I just have to have them have a lower number than the other one. So I could even have negative numbers here. If I say -1, then you see the mountains went behind. And if I say 1, then the mountains go in front. All right, so the order in layer is how we're going to control which sprite draws on top of which sprite. All right, so to start with my scrolling backgrounds, the first thing I do is I take the actual sprite and I drag and drop it in here. This white outline is the game Windows view. So whatever's in the white outline is what's going to show in my 2D game. So the sprite's too small right now. I just want to make sure that my sprite is, let me use this tool. I want to make sure that my sprite is big enough to cover the game window. All right, so as long as the game window is within the sprite, that's a a well enough size sprite. And then once I have that, let me just start with these. I'll take them out. These are prefabs. Okay. Once I have the sprite size the way I want it to, I could drag and drop it here and turn it into a prefab. So I size the clouds. Okay, now I can remove it. Now let me take the mountains, and I want to also size the mountains to be bigger than the game window. And then I could make a prefab out of the mountains. And then I have the trees, which I will also make sure that it's bigger than the rectangle for the screen, and make a prefab out of the trees. So I made a prefab out of my 3 backgrounds, and now I'm ready to start to use these 3 as my background scrolling images. All right, so what I'm going to do here is make an empty game object, and I'll just call it background. Well, I'll just call it clouds. I'm going to make clouds my furthest background. Cloud scroll. And to it, I'm going to add a script here that was created already called scroller. I'll show you what's inside the script. But the first thing that the scroller script has is a speed that it's going to scroll. So if it's a negative number, the scrolling is going to go this way. And if it was a positive number, then the scrolling will go to the right. So I have a -1 by default. And let's put in that it wants a background prefab. So I'm going to pick the clouds and give that as my background prefab. And this is the only background right now, so it doesn't matter what the order and layer is. If I press play, the script should create 2 of those backgrounds and then scroll. So as we can see, -1 is that fast, and we could just play around with it and say that we have the background for the cloud scrolling really slow. So I'm going to make it 0.05. Okay, now that's the first background that I have. And let me just show you the scrolling script. This scrolling script was explained in another scroll video I have. But this one for the parallax scrolling, it has a little bit extra. So let me just go through explaining this. First of all, I made a structure to hold the background information of the sprite and its percent position and its scroll position in percentages. Okay, so now for the public variables that are shown in the inspector, the user could control the scroll speed. The user could specify what's the background to use, and they could drag and drop the prefab. And then over here, this is the order in layer. So since we could have more than one scrolling background, order in layer controls which one is in front of which one. The higher the number, the closer it is to the user, and those get drawn on top. The lower number, those get drawn in the back. So for every scrolling background, I need 2 sprites that I'm actually going to instantiate so that they could take turns swapping and taking place as one scrolls in, the other one is scrolling in, and then this one gets drawn over again over there at the beginning. So let me take that out. And then for knowing how far to scroll, I need to know how wide the sprite is and where the scrolling will start and where the scrolling will end before it draws itself over again to start scrolling over again. All right, so here's the code that initializes the 2 sprites, the 2 sprite images that I'm going to use for scrolling the clouds. In this one, I guess I used, right, cloud scroll. And the first background image and the second background image, they're basically the same code. The only difference is going to be where they start. So 100% is all the way to the right, and 0.05 is 50% in 50% of the scroll. Since I have 2 images, that's basically 100% divided by 2. That's 50% and 50%. So I got 0.5 and 1. All right, so the first thing I do is I instantiate a sprite. And when the sprite is instantiated, it's going to be a child of the object that the script is attached to, cloud scroll. Then after I instantiate the sprite, I get a pointer to the renderer, and I make sure that I set the sorting order to the value that the user put for order in layer. And then I set the position of the sprite as halfway between the start and the end. Then over here on the second sprite, I do the same thing, except I set the position of the sprite and percent to be all the way at the end. Now this is for knowing when the scrolling is supposed to wrap over and repeat. I get the width. The width I can get by using by getting a pointer to the sprite renderer. The sprite renderer is, if you look at a sprite, it's this component right here. And once I get the sprite renderer, there's a property called bounds.size. And now I can know how big it is in the X. And that will tell me basically the size up here in X of the sprite. And then I use that width to mark the start will be positive of the width and the end will be negative of the width. So here would be the middle. Negative of the width makes sure that the whole sprite was drawn in. All right, so this was gone over in the first video. Now over here in the update function, because start function gets called when the game starts, and then the update function is doing the scrolling. The percent is, I keep the percent as a value between 0 and 1 by using the repeat function and the math repeat function. So basically the first parameter is my value. So it's whatever my percent was the last time I hit update, and then I subtract a little bit from it so I could go closer and closer to 0. But then the math repeat keeps the value between 0 and 1. So as soon as this value goes less than 0, it becomes 1 again. Then the math lerp function is going to translate that percent value from, from a 1.0 to a 0.0. It's going to translate that into an x position. So lerp takes one value and a second value, so between these two values, and this is a percentage between the two values that I get a value back. And then I set the position of my sprite to that. Okay, so that's the scroll function, and when I attached it just to this cloud scroll, and I have it for scrolling the clouds, and I press play, play I press, I think I just showed you this part. Yeah, it starts scrolling the clouds. So now I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this, and I'm going to do another scroll background, but this one's going to be for the mountains. Okay, so I'll call it mountain scroll. Okay, and instead of using clouds on this one, I'm going to take the mountain prefab and put it on there. And I want the mountains to be drawn on top of the clouds. So instead of a value of 0, I'm going to increment it to 1. And the speed, I want it to go, well, if they're going at the same speed, let's see what happens. So I press play, and they're going at the same speed. I want to slow the speeds down. So clouds, I'm going to make clouds be minus 0.05. And then for mountains, let's make that one minus 0.1. Let's try that and see how that looks. Let's see that looks. We start seeing a little effect of things further away. Okay, so the clouds are scrolling slower and then the mountains are scrolling faster. Now I could just do this again and add another layer. So let me just do a duplicate again. And for the next layer, I'm going to do the trees. So I'm just going to call this one trees scroll. And for the prefab, I'm going to use trees instead. My trees prefab. So I had 0.05, 0.1, and let's just say that these are going to go by at a speed of minus 0.1, 0.1, 0.1. I don't know, let's say minus 1. Okay, let's see how that looks. Oh, and I forgot to change the order and layer. Okay, I'm going to make this a 2 to make sure it stays on top, and the speed I'll say minus 0.5. Now I press play. Okay, so now we basically kind of have like a parallax scrolling background. And I could change the values here depending on how I want the relation to be between them all. Now one last thing I did here was I added in underdog. So let me just drag him and drop him. That's the sprite of underdog, and he's a little bit kind of big. So I'll just use the scale tool and shrink him down a little bit more. And let me just move him in a little bit more. Okay, and then I have a user control script, so I can move the dog underdog up and down. So let me just drag and drop that on underdog. Drag and drop. And the user control script just has a move speed, so how fast he can move, and the upper limit and the lower limit of his move. So from 2 to minus 1.5. And the user control script looks like this. Here I just have the public variables, move speed, upper limit, and lower limit, and they have defaults. And then here in the update function, I have, I get an input from the vertical axis, and that's going to be a value from it's a value from -1 to 1. And the fact that it's getting an input from the vertical axis, that's defined in the input manager, which I will show you is part of the project settings input. Yeah, where are you? Where are you? Coming on up. Okay, here's the input manager. And here you see is a setting called vertical. And vertical is the up and down key, or if you have a joystick, or it reads from a couple of things. It reads from the W and the S, the up key and the down key. And this is why vertical means something when I say get access, because it's there in the input manager, and that's vertical. And then now that I have the vertical input, I'm just going to see if it's okay to move, because I don't want to move if I'm at the limit. If I'm at one of the limits, I don't want to move. So if the vertical input is on the negative side, then I'm going to check to see that the position of underdog is not at the lower limit. Because if it's not at the lower limit yet and you're moving, down, then it's okay to move still. If the input is to say to go up, but I'm not at the upper limit yet, then it's okay to move. So this over here just sees if it's okay to do the move or not. So now after I find that out, I say, okay, it's okay to move. Then I'll actually do the move command. So it's transform.translate, and which axis do I want to move on? So up is the positive and down is the negative. So vert3.up times the vert times the move speed, and then I always multiply by time delta time so that on all computers the speed is the same. And that's my user control. And the only other thing I could think of here is, say if I want the underdog to move around at different speeds, like faster and slower, but I want that to affect all of the scrolls equally, I would add a thing for the scroller here. I'd add a public variable called like a multiplier, all right, because the speed is the speed it goes at, but then I could add a float multiplier, so if underdog starts flying faster or slower, so first the multiplier is just at a 1. It's not moving anything faster or slower. And this is a public variable. Then over here in the script, when I'm doing the movement, I could, let's see, right here at the percent, the speed, I could multiply by the multiplier. Multiplier. I spell that right. Well, I probably didn't spell it right somewhere. So let me just copy this one and paste it. Okay, where's that paste? Boom. And over here, I multiply the speed by the multiplier. Boom. Okay. And now, if I want the underdog to move faster or slower, I could set the multiplier value for all three of these guys. So here's underdog. Let me just go to the underdog user control script. And that was the vertical movement. Now let me read for the horizontal movement, which I'll use to control the speed, equals input.get axis horizontal. And then what I'll do is for each of those other scripts, the cloud scroll, the mountain scroll, and the tree scroll, which I'm going to have a pointer to them in my script over here. So let's get that public cloud scroll. I'll call it cloud. Not could, cloud. And then I'll have a pointer for the, it's not, it's cloud, it's scroller. That's the name of the script, scroller for the cloud, and I'll get a pointer to the script scroller of the mountains, and I'll get a pointer to the script public scroller to the trees. Okay, so with the pointer to the scripts, I could change the multiplier in all three of those scripts. So for clouds, cloud dot multiplier equals, it's going to equal 1.0 plus, what was my horizontal value? Horizontal. And then for the same thing on the other one, so for my mountain dot multiplier equals 1.0f plus horizontal. And here I guess I'm missing an f. Yep. And then for the last one, trees dot multiplier equals 1.0f plus horizontal too. Okay. So that'll change the multiplier on the scripts, which will change basically the speed that the things are scrolling by at. Okay, let me see if that works here. So first thing I'm gonna have to do is the user control. Once the script reads, it's gonna want the cloud script. It's gonna want the mountains script and the tree scroll script pointer. Okay, let's see what happens. If I press play and I'm not pressing anything, I shouldn't have, where'd my underdog go? Okay, what's underdog's layer? Underdog, he doesn't have an order and layer. So let me see, I had this order and layer was a 0, then this one is a 1, and then this one is a 2. So let's make underdog 9 just to make sure. And let's press play. And now I'm using my joystick, so I'm moving up and down. And now if I move forward, it flies faster. And if I move backward, he flies and he stops even. Okay, so it's like, and he stops. And if I go more forward, he flies faster. So the multiplier thing works. Anyway, this was a tutorial for the parallax scrolling effect, I guess with a little extra of this underdog guy flying around. Thanks very much.